Hi, this section of Congress is going to go over powers. So we're going to be looking at the powers in Article 1, Section 8. We're going to be going over what Congress can do, and these are specific for Congress. So we're going to go ahead and start. The Constitution grants Congress a number of specific powers in three different ways. Number one, they have the express powers that are granted to Congress explicitly. They're numbered in Article 1, Section 8. Then there's the implied powers are granted by a reasonable deduction from the express powers. That's the necessary and proper clause, number 18. And then the inherent powers are granted through the Constitution's creation of a national government for the United States. Inherent basically means that Congress has powers basically because it's a national government and all governments have these powers. It's whether it's China, Saudi Arabia, the US, just because you're a national government, you have these inherent powers. So there's two different views of the Constitution. One is a strict constructionist. That's where they basically argue that Congress should only be able to exercise its expressed powers, and those implied powers absolutely necessary to carry out the expressed. You follow the Constitution directly. Thomas Jefferson led this. He was a big anti-federalist. And then you had the liberal constructionists. These were led by Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist, favored a liberal interpretation of the Constitution, a broad interpretation of the implied powers given to Congress and the powers given to Congress, but basically doing more, making it larger, bigger. So the big change from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution was the power to tax. Constitution gives Congress the power to tax, lay, collect duties, impose excise, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare. So that was in Article 1, Section 8, power to tax. Limits on the taxing power. Tax is a charge levied by the government on persons or property to meet public needs. Constitution places 4 limits on the power to tax. May only be for public purposes, not for private benefit, not like an individual or for Congress's benefit. Congress may not tax exports. That was specifically stated in the Constitution. Direct taxes must be supported among the states according to their populations. Indirect taxes must be levied at a uniform rate in all parts of the country. So these are the 4 limitations on taxing. Here is the definite spending that's coming and to pay for the taxes. On the left side, mandatory spending that has already been done by law that cannot be changed. That's your Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits that can't be changed. Then you have discretionary budget, and then you have the defense. That's commerce, labor, agriculture, transportation, justice, and all of the others. So there's a different spending that we have, and right now it's $4.4 trillion that we do government spending with. Borrowing, Congress gives the power of Congress to borrow money on the credit of the U.S. Deficit financing is the practice of spending more money than received in revenue and borrowing to make up the difference, and that's what we're doing currently right now because we have a deficit and national debt. The public debt is all of the money borrowed by the government over the years, and it's not yet repaid, plus the accumulated interest. So the debt is adding up all of the surpluses and deficits for every year, and then you get your national public debt. The deficit is in 1 year spending more money than you actually take in. Commerce power, this is one of the big powers of Congress. It's the power of Congress to regulate interstate and foreign trade. It's granted in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. There are 4 limits to this. Congress cannot, again, tax exports. Congress cannot favor ports of one state over ports of another state in the regulation of trade. Congress cannot interfere in or require, vessels bound to and from one state to be obliged to enter, clear, and pay duties in another state. So they cannot require ships going from one state to the other to pay duties. And then Congress cannot interfere with the slave trade up until 1808, which was 20 years after doing the Constitution. So they couldn't stop the slave trade until then. These are some other powers of Congress. The currency power, Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money and regulate the value of that. Legal tender is any kind of money that a creditor must accept in payment for debts. The bankruptcy power, the Constitution gives Congress the power to establish uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcy. So, when you can be bankrupt, how long, what debts that you get rid of. And bankruptcy is the legal proceedings in which a bankrupt person's assets are distributed among creditors who a debt is owned. And if there are no more assets, then basically they are forgiven their debts and they don't have to pay them back. And currently, you can do that once every 10 years. It does affect your credit and it does hurt people. But there's people and businesses that have done it 3 and 4 times. It's not as big for businesses to do it, but it seems for people it's a lot worse. Foreign relations and war powers. Congress has the inherent power to act on matters affecting the security of the nation. The war powers are extensive for Congress. So, Congress has the power to raise and support an army, to provide and maintain a navy, to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. Congress has the power to restrict the use of American forces in combat areas where there is a state of war does not exist. This is the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And remember, Congress has the power to declare war. Other express powers, naturalization, is the process by which citizens of one country become citizens of another. So it's how they become citizens of the US. Postal power, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7 says Congress has the power to establish post offices and post roads. Copyrights and patents. Copyright is the exclusive right of an author to reproduce, publish, and sell their own creative work. Patent grants a person the sole right to manufacture, to use, to sell any new useful art, machine, manufacturers. So, like if you are making something, you want to get a patent so other people can't take it and use it for business purposes. Weights and measures. Congress has the power to fix standard weights and measures throughout the US. I remember when I was in high school, there was a big push to go to the metric system, and there was a big debate on that, but Congress turned that down. We have our inches, our pounds, our Senate. We don't do the metric system. Judicial powers. Congress may create all of the courts below the Supreme Court. Structure of the federal judiciary, the size of the Supreme Court. They also define federal crimes, set up punishments for violations of federal laws. They have power over the territories and other areas. Territories could be Guam, Puerto Rico. The other areas could be the national parks and the federal lands. And then Congress and the federal government has the power through eminent domain, which is the inherent power to take private property for public use. So typically, they would take somebody's property to build a road or a school or a park. These are all the Article 1, Section 8 powers. So you have the peacetime powers 1 through 18, like on the left hand side, and then the war powers 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 for declare war, raise armies, raise navies, and so on. So take a look at these. These are the powers of Congress, which are pretty extensive. They're pretty big. It's very interesting that most people think the president of the Supreme Court has more power than the Congress. But the founding fathers definitely wanted Congress to be the number one branch. They were Article 1, so as Congress was the first branch. They had the most powers, they had the most pages written in the Constitution. So here we go. The necessary and proper clause gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out the execution of the foregoing powers, and all powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. So this is the necessary and proper clause. It's also called the elastic clause, and it's the implied powers. Battle over implied powers. So first we started with the Bank of the United States, caused controversy between Jefferson and Hamilton, strict and liberal constructionists. So did the United States have the power to set up a first bank of the United States? In McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, the formation of the second bank was challenged by the strict constructionists. They accepted the first one, but then the second one they fought. Chief Justice Marshall ruled in favor of the second bank, giving Congress and the federal government approval. The Maryland could not tax a national bank, and the implied powers was allowed. So this was a very important case. It did say that implied powers were there. And then banking was an implied power, creating a bank because the Congress had the express power to borrow, they had the power to tax, they had the power to regulate commerce, they could do banking, plus weights and measures also. So here are the implied powers of Congress. Express powers to establish naturalization law. The implied powers is to regulate, limit immigration. Express powers is to establish post office. The implied powers to prohibit mail fraud, obstruction of the mails, to bar shipping of items through the mail. So, express power to borrow money, implied power is to establish the Federal Reserve. So, here's a listing of different express powers and then the implied powers. So, look at that one: express power to raise an army and navy, the implied power to draft Americans into the military. Pretty big. Express power to regulate commerce, implied power to establish a minimum wage, to ban discrimination, to pass laws about the disabled, to regulate banking. That also could be, Obamacare, Social Security, Medicare. But, a lot of people say it's not constitutional, but the express powers regulate commerce. The implied power is minimum wage, Civil Rights Act, and they've all been approved by the courts. Constitutional amendments, Article 5 gives Congress the power to propose amendments by two-thirds vote in each house. In certain instances, Congress is given the power to do special electoral duties. So, like for example, if the president doesn't get a majority in the Electoral College, the House decides the election. If no candidate for vice president gets a majority, the Senate decides the election for VP. And also, if the VP is vacated, the president selects a successor, and then both House and Senate, have to approve by basically two-thirds vote in both houses to get the new person taking the office. Okay. Impeachment power. We've gone through this with President Trump, and we've gone through it with Bill Clinton. We went through the beginning stages with Nixon and then Andrew Johnson. The Constitution grants Congress the power of removing the president, VP, or other civil offices through impeachment. House has the sole power to impeach or bring charges against the individual. Then there's a trial in the Senate. Two-thirds of the Senator's president is needed for conviction. We've never had a conviction. We've been close. One vote for Andrew Johnson, but it's not been. It's typically by party lines. The penalty for impeachment is removal from office. So that bottom part, the penalty for impeachment is removal from office. Executive powers. Congress has things with appointments and treaties. All major appointments made by the president must be confirmed by Senate by majority vote. Only 12 of the 600 cabinet appointments to date have been declined. Senatorial courtesy is the practice in which the Senate will turn down an appointment if it is opposed by the senator of the president's party from that state where the person's actually been appointed. So if somebody was appointed by, say, John McCain did this from Arizona, they'd ask John McCain about this person, and if he said no, then they would not accept that person. The president makes treaties by advice and consent of the Senate. Two-thirds of the Senate must concur and approve the treaty. President often consults members of the Senate Foreign Relations about any treaties. So these are executive powers. And then Congress has investigatory power. They can choose to conduct investigations through standing committees for several reasons: to gather information useful to Congress in making legislation and laws, to oversee the executive branches and their agencies like the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, ATF, to focus attention on a particular subject, to expose questionable activities of public officials or private people, people that were taking private airplanes in the beginning of Trump's administration, and they were spending a lot of money doing private jets and private travel to promote the particular interests of some members of Congress. So this is the investigatory power of Congress. Okay. And those are the powers of Congress, and we're basically finished with this part. And after this, we're going to look at committees and how a bill becomes a law. So here is the powers of Congress. Make sure you know these. Go back and review those. And thank you very much.